Hi, I'm Seamless, and today is Friday, which means it's time for a new how to bass tutorial. Today, I'm going to show you how to make this sound, which I'm going to turn down because I don't want to feedback like you wouldn't believe. Or more likely, this sound. The second one is pretty cool, but it's a little bit like too intense, if you know what I mean. So like if you like that one, it's whatever, but it's not that bad. Anyway, the progression of what happened here is that this began as this sound. It turned into this sound. Turned into this sound. Turned into this sound. This is my first actual real video back from me being back from the Netherlands. The Netherlands. It's almost as bad to say as synthesis. I have a real problem with the apparently. The. And I felt like I wanted to go big. So this guy, this is a whole bunch of automation and a lot of really small things. Like I have the latency view on, which explains what's going on with this guy. We'll talk about that. But I'm doing a lot of. I haven't pulled out all the stops, but I pulled out most of them, and I'm doing a lot of things to just do incredible things, and all really small decisions that sort of result in being this sound, and then granularized it with this thing here. Now this is actually a pretty unprecedented kind of granulizing for me, because usually when I granulize stuff, I tend to just go to let fate determine what the sound is going to be like. I just kind of do random parameters. Well, not random parameters per se. The parameters I know very specifically which ones I'm going to do, but how I move them and where they go tend to be pretty random. And then I just kind of let it do whatever, and I take what parts work. And then I did Harmor resampling, and then second Harmor resampling. So this is a pretty intense and varied sound, and we're going to go over what makes everything tick. In the beginning, it was a Harmor. This Harmor, by itself, sounds like this. And there's a lot happening to it. Doesn't really sound like there's a lot happening to it, but there's a lot happening to it. So, I have my 9 voices unison, and I'm using a lot of unison index mapping. What unison index mapping is, if you go to any particular parameter, go to articulator, you can see that just in the list, there's unison index mapping. And this allows us to change that parameter's position per unison voice. So see we have 9 voices here, and there's 9 poles, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, counting the sides. This lets us just change parameters per unison voice, which is super handy for when we want to make evenly balanced stereo images or just crazy, silly things. For example, I have the prism set up here, and I have changed the prism shape to be a denser version of its default self. This is just a waveline type, and it's just doing kind of that thing. I have it on, but in the articulator, I have unison index mapping doing this. Now, when you see an emulator, an envelope window, line editor window like this, where there's like a top and a bottom, a very distinct center, versus something like this, where it's only just top to bottom, that means that this is a 0 to 100 window, and then this is a 100 to negative 100 window. So over here, this is the value, right? So that means that when it's 100% fully that, it's 100% what's going on there. And then every other voice, this voice, and then this one is nothing. This is center. This is off. This voices they have proportionally less. So this is 100%. Then this is I think this is actually straight up quarters. So 75, 50, 25. So it means 75% of that, 50% of that, 25% of that. And then it goes the other way. It goes past the center to the opposite side, which for Prism, what the Prism does is that if it's a shape like this, here's your line, here's here, this means that these harmonics get pulled up and these harmonics get pulled down. And then if you flip it, it means that this harmonic gets pulled up and this harmonic gets pulled down. That's what the difference between the 100% and negative 100% means. So this means that each unison voice has a different Prism profile. So along with actually having unison, it means that every individual voice is different in even more different ways. And that's kind of the theme for this particular preset, where pretty much every kind of pitch change a thing is being engaged to create the difference of pitch per unison voice. The other one being the other main one being the phaser. I have it set to frequency mode and harmonic mode, which is doing a number of things, because harmonic mode in Harmor actually changes the phaser's position based on the harmonic's pitch. So in the unison, actually, and here in the unison window, and also the prism, because it's changing the unison pitch differently per harmonic, it actually changes the shape of the phaser, which it's kind of hard to tell when we're doing it in frequency mode, but in volume mode, you can see the difference quite clearly. I've done had bases that like revolved entirely around that. So similarly, this articulator is meaning that all these voices are different, and this is essentially, because we're in frequency mode, it's applying the changes that you normally get on a phaser, which are volume based, and changing that parameter to be applied to the pitch. I ate before I did this video. I think I just ate part of my mustache. So again, we're setting, like, now you see how these curves, you know, they're doing curves or whatever, where these are does not matter at all, except for where they intersect the poles that represent the individual voices. And the information going on in the middle of the voices does not a single thing. Just so you're aware, because you see me do these kinds of things. I also have the width changing, and the width, of course, changes. You know, you normally see the phaser, you see where the holes and the lines are. The width changes how wide those holes are. So that means every individual voice now has a radically different phaser profile, radically different changes in pitch over time, and same thing with the offset, also set to be different. So the frequency and the position and the motion and the change, all of that are radically different per voice, which crunched all together with 9 other ones causes extremely unique phase cancellation, which is giving us the particular tone of the sound. I have the harmonizer on, and it's on only a little bit, just because, like, that's really super necessary. This graph I mentioned before, the harmonic unison pitch, this changes how much unison depth there is per harmonic voice, per harmonic. And this is really keeping like the sort of the high mids like a little bit less, but then the high is really high, and then the rest of it's fairly normal. But the fact that it's different is again also creating very interesting phase cancellation profiles. We're basically making the superest saw here, because the whole point of a super saw is that you're clashing together different pitches of the same harmonic profile to create a unique phase cancellation. And all the layering and all the effects and all the processing anybody ever does with a super saw is to do that, is to create interesting high frequency phase cancellation. So that's what we're doing here, but we're doing it at an additive level with individual harmonic control, and doing it. And honestly, you could arrive at this with regular subtractive synthesis, but it would take forever. That's one of the reasons why Harmor is particularly awesome. I have a little bit of phase randomness, but it's not fully random, which means some of the harmonics are actually kind of still staying aligned. This would still get kind of like the sharpness of a saw wave, but it's honestly kind of moot in the face of how much ridiculousness is happening. Does this have an articulator? It does. I could have had vibrato depth be different per voice. How freaky would that be? What else am I changing? So the pluck shape. All right. So yeah, pluck. So what the pluck does in Harmor is that this graph, if you can go to the pluck shape, it represents how much time a harmonic takes to decay. The pluck is almost all the way up, which means that they're all taking kind of a while. But if you notice when I play a note, like when it starts, these holes kind of show up, and these holes are corresponding entirely to this here. So this is saying that like over time these guys diminish, this diminishes, and it creates a kind of like a pre-formant where at the very beginning of the creation of these harmonics, these holes are being introduced, and that's causing it to be formed a little bit. And because it's note following, because this is a per harmonic change, like this harmonic is still that harmonic. Even when you move it around, you can see it follows like the slides and that kind of thing. This will create an interesting profile when it's forced against all the filtering that happens later. Anything else interesting happening here? Don't think so. A little bit of distortion, but the mix is fairly even, so we got enough dry and also a little bit of wet. A lot more dry actually than usual. It's a bit of compression to kind of push it up. Not super hard there. I had a chorus on it for kind of a while, but then I decided to take it off. So now the first step here is that I have this is a bandpass and a notch. It's a really thick notch. If you go to order, you can set this deep 8, and it creates a very sharp, kind of wide notch. And this is a regular 2-level bandpass, which is to say it's pretty slight, but it's thin. It's slightly thinner. This is automating against itself, and so is this one here, which is actually the same exact EQ and the same exact automation, the same two poles. It's just that this one has Vocodex processing, and this one does not. But you see here that there's a Vocodex. What's the point of that? Well, I wanted to merge two different automations where one was a normal sound and one was a Vocodex version of it, and it worked out fine. The only problem is that, as you can see here, this introduces latency, and if I just had this here, it sort of created a not all that wonderful kind of phase cancellation, which I was sort of I didn't want. So I put the same Vocodex in there, but I turned off the wet, and I turned up one of these regular ones and took the filter all the way off. So really what's happening is that we're just getting the dry sound out of here, but delayed accordingly with the Vocodex. And actually the delay, what's responsible for the delay is not actually the Vocodex. It's the mixer, or rather the freaking sound goodizer, this guy here. I'm using the sound goodizer in here, and if I didn't use it at all, watch what happens to the latency. Goes away. Because the sound goodizer is Maximus, and Maximus introduces latency. At least if you set it up to do so. Like, I'm not sure, like, this actually has more latency than the actual Maximus does. And that's because the latency is created entirely, more or less, by how much latency is set up here. You see, I got rid of it entirely if I did that there. But there's a reason for that latency. That's about right. Yeah. Now, the actual Vocodex itself, let's go look at that. It's very slight in terms of like its overall effect, but I'm automating the bandwidth here, and the actual automation that I chose to do this with, I think it's this one here. I actually changed a little bit because I had the range that I set here, but then I came in here and I moved the minimum all kind of pretty far up. That's because I didn't really like that ringy sound, which is from the bands being too thin. There's other things I could have done to solve that, but the actual tone itself in the Vocodex was not that important. It just had to be very different to the normal kind, because the filtering that I'm doing with the two EQs are different, two different automations. The main bandpass, and then the notch, bandpass and notch. So it means that like when one might come down, the other one might come up. So we have like a chain, sort of bubbling edge of the normal sound, and then the Vocodex version of the sound, which keeps you guessing, I guess, kind of the actual origin of the tone, which is kind of nice. Not doing a lot with this is all pretty typical stuff. 100 bands. Keep up the band distribution, which forces it into this configuration, where we have more bands lower or less bands low and more bands high. That's what this shape creates when you do that in the band distribution window. Modulator pitch shift is actually pushing up some of the higher frequencies to kind of fill up the high end, because you lose some of that if you're not really careful with it. And bandwidth, again, this was our original solution before I just put up the automation to not be too awful. Really high release time, but because this is a self-modulating Vocodex, which is to say that the carrier and the modulator are the same source, it's not that important. It's a little bit important just because if you go too low with the minimum times off, it kind of distorts in a very interesting way, which isn't really bad, but isn't what I wanted for this particular sound. Don't have the wet all the way up, although this is all off, so like it's the only signal there. It doesn't really matter. So that's that sound. That's that part of the sound anyway. Come on. So these add together to create a sort of interesting tone. It gets EQ'd here before the distortion, just to kind of shape how it's supposed to go into the distortion. In the past, when I would do this sort of filtering, this is the part that used to stump me, because when you filter a lot of it like this, like you're filtering a huge here, even you can just see here by the shape, like more often than not a huge amount of audio is coming through, and you lose all your gain, and then there's not really, you can try turning it up, but that's what the compression is for. So the distortion helps. But the hero here is the compression. So, I mean, I've done kinds of sounds like this before, and it really works by just coming in here and pumping up the low, mid, high, so that the sounds there are kind of brought back up, but independently, so that we have an evenly distributed sort of frequency profile. And then I, again, pulling up on a master to just kind of make it loud. The time variables that are creating the latency, the attack on the master, and the elevation delay are here to prevent a particular kind of distortion that happens when your time variables are too fast. And I didn't want the Maximus to color it too much. Another EQ to kind of solve some problems, and then a delay. And I'm automating some parameters here. I have the overall wet, and then how much feedback there is on the actual delay. This is a kind of delay that we're using to generate a bit more like that kind of transformery robot sound. because the time setting is super duper duper low. And like, how low it is and what setting I chose is mostly just to taste. But what I'm doing here is that in the first filter, rather the first feedback, the first delay, there's 8 of them you can see in the delay bank. It's going out, but it's also going into the next delay, and this one is also delaying and also being really short. So this means that the delay is a bit more complex than just being a straight up single delay, causing the tone to be what it is. However, it is too complex to kind of leave on the whole time, which is why there's a wet control, which is keeping it on. So it shows up every once in a while. It sounds neat, and then it shows. Then the feedback increases, so that we're sort of in control of that. Where I chose to put it wasn't really like on purpose for any kind of reason. It was mostly random, but like as long as it wasn't there the whole time, then it doesn't sound like you just killed it with delay. And then a limiter to kind of bring it back down because that created issues. At least it did originally. Huh. Must have solved itself with some other things that I must have done. There were gigantic, ridiculous peaks. You can see there's some like 1 or 2 there, but like it's not really that bad. So that created that sound. And then I rendered it into an Edison. There that is. And then I dropped it into a granulizer. So now we're going to the part where we make this. So I have a compressor on the end of this, just mostly just to pull it back up, but without that. So this is, as I said before, this is way different than my typical strategy when it comes to granular stuff. It's mostly because the actual process of granulizing is really hard to control. And it took me kind of a long time to get to the point where I understood enough about what was happening to do things on purpose. So let's explain sort of how granulizing works. The granulizer by default, when you drop it in audio and you play it, it sounds like the regular, normal, unaltered audio. However, it is still actually granulizing. The cuts are just created in such a way that when they're added together, they make the original sound. So that it doesn't. So you start somewhere normal. The 3 parameters I'm automating are the hold, the grain spacing, and the wave spacing. Sometimes I automate the attack, but it's usually it's fine the way it is now. In the manual for the granulizer, there's actually a pretty decent explanation about what each of these things are in terms of what literally happens, but we can kind of approximate it with my own paraphrasing. Hold time is essentially how much space there is between grains. You might be thinking grain spacing, like what is that? Maybe that's what hold is. So hold is like how long the grains are, and then grain spacing is how much space there is between grains, which the combination of these two things changes quite a lot about how the grains perform. So like if you have a sound, you chop it up in the grains, and then you have how long the grain is, and then you have how far apart the grain is. So if you shorten how long the grain is, but the space between each grain remains the same, that means the total length of all the audio crunches up a bit. This is where the wave spacing comes in. Wave spacing essentially is how fast it's playing through how fast it's scanning through the audio. So like with its default configuration where it's 100% speed is going at normal speed, each grain is just the setting of the speed. And then if you increase or decrease the wave spacing, it'll essentially, if you like increase it, for example, so that it's playing the audio slower, I guess that's decreasing it. What happens is that like there's the cut, and then the next cut after it kind of contains some of the part from the original sound as well. And the grains are small enough that it doesn't necessarily sound like you're overlapping, but sometimes you can with the attack if you mess around with the attack, but we're not messing with that with this one. So it's not literally what's happening, but we could think of this as how fast it's playing the audio, how fast it's cutting up the audio, and how long each individual cuts are. And messing with these 3 parameters will get you lots of stuff. So what I did to do this on purpose is that over here in the time setting, I set key to %. You can do different things here. You can actually change the pitch with playing it. You can different steps. I'm not totally sure what step is. And the transient, this is good for like drum kind of stuff, but because it goes to like the next transient, that kind of thing. But the percentage here means that when we go to the piano roll, we see this percentage. So this means that like this starts at 0%, this starts at 4% if I play it here. And I just keyed it up to say 0, 25, 50, 75. So this means that, because this is fairly cut up in the bar pattern, right? 1 bar, 2 bar, 3 bar, 4 bar. So that being the same length, being the same tempo, being the same everything else means that we're looking at this as representing 1 bar, 2 bar, 3 bar, 4 bar. And then I made automation clips for those 3 parameters and their default positions, and then I copied the value of the automation clips point, and I pasted it at every bar. So you can see that this big cut, it kind of goes here. That's what these are. These are all that position. So this is saying that while we're re-triggering at the next bar in the audio, we're also re-triggering starting at the original position where it sounds normal. So this means whatever the hell we do in the midst of that doesn't affect what happens later. This is super duper important because usually what happens when I do Granular, I just have one big note. It just plays it. I turn looping on in over here, which is off by default, which means that when you run out of audio, it just starts it over again. Because if remember we said before about changing the grain spacing where it makes it a lot smaller, you can very easily run out of audio because you play it too fast. So looping is good for that particular purpose. But I just make a big note, wildly alter parameters, and now like where we are in the audio and like what notes are being played are just lost. We don't have control of that anymore. But this allows us to do on purpose kind of subtle transformations of the sound and actually keep it in the beat, which I mean this particular sound is there's no song or anything. This sound design stage is not that important, but it's I thought about this the other day. I was like, I should probably experiment with this, and this is what that is. So here we have the whole time, the grain spacing and time envelope amount, and then on the wave spacing amount. So the wave spacing is actually a 100% negative 100% value, and the top value is it moves forward, and the bottom value means it moves backwards. So if you go below 50%, it will move backwards. If you go at 50%, it won't move at all. So that's how that kind of thing works. And I basically just kind of move things around until they sounded right in the individual bars, ensuring that they restarted at the correct default position at the next every next bar. So like for example, the whole time. Really, I guess that really has to be the length between grains. Because if I jack it the fuck up, or maybe it is the length of the grain. The manual actually did a pretty good job of explaining it. I probably should have read it before I did this and explained it to you, but like it's sort of helpful to sort of see how I'm doing this because I'm making these decisions not based on that explanation, but at least a sort of internalized experiential idea of sort of what happens when things happen. And like this is a good example of just kind of like you could very clearly see the result of what a particular value, so you can sort of infer where you want to go based on that. But like for this moment, like where it kind of like chops up for a second, I do the same thing kind of later like over here. And it kind of behaves way different, and that's because the grain spacing is much faster, which means that this value would have to be much higher for it to actually have the same kind of impact. So then I put a backspin on top of that to even it out. Lower than usual time variables, and the two latent positions off completely. Nothing going on here. I'm not doing anything low mid high, just full on limiting it. And then I recorded Edison and dropped it into this Harmor here. Now this Harmor also does a lot of crazy things. I put any automation. I'm very sorry about this. Come on. All right. So A and B are being used, and this is because there's stereo information in the sound that I want to do, and I want to do stereo resampling. So what you do is you drop the same audio file into A and B, but you can see that they're different. Gonna sneeze? Not gonna sneeze? Okay. And that's because in the advanced tab of B, I have engaged side. So now, because usually when you just drop it in there, it's mono, but it's not really like, it's not like left mono or class mono, it's mid. It is a mid-side split. So then we have B is side and A is mid. And you can also see that there's different settings in the two of them. So I applied different processing to the mid versus the side, and just that's why it feels particularly sort of distinct from itself, which is kind of interesting. Now, my typical, like the old school Harmor resampling process is that I put it in there, engage two voices in unison, really small pitch amounts, and then we get that nice sort of noisier style phase cancellation that you get when you do that with anything. But the reason why it sounds unique is because Harmor isn't perfect. It's a resynthesis of the original sound with a limited number of harmonics, and it does a pretty good job, but it's not perfect. It's pretty good, though. So I have it on high precision. I didn't turn off denoise on this. I usually do. Grain spacing is all the way down, and then the ramping is all the way down, which means that it's a little bit more sort of higher resolution than usual in terms of where it's going motion-wise. Derp. That's pretty neat. So actually what we're looking at right here is using index mapping with the volume. And this solves a particular problem that I had a while ago that I just couldn't figure out, which was that the effect of the unison is very, very deep. It's super like present, and there's not a lot of ways to fade it out. Like if I did less unison, it's just the same sound, only slower. Like it just goes through the same progression. So I realized to myself, oh, I could just use the index mapping on the volume and turn down the volume on the other voice, which means that it's still doing the phase cancellation, but the effect isn't as like in your face. It's still pretty in your face because it's like 75%, so it's not like a huge cut, but it's enough. I have prism engaged, which I believe is just a default prism, yeah, which adds a little bit to kind of the pitch and uncertainty of things. I turned on the format mix, and I changed the format in the image format mutation tab very, very slightly. I'm not doing like my usual gigantic changes, but it's actually different from A to B. So there's different format changes on the side than there are on the mid, which is adding to like the big spread that you have, which is why I have this crossfader all the way over to A over here, because the changes were so ridiculously stark that it felt too big, and so I wanted to rein it in a little bit by essentially fading more towards the side, or mid rather. What else important? I have harmonic protection, which is actually kind of hard to use when we're doing resampling, because this is what the bass looks like, as opposed to just being a harmonic, but it does its best to kind of like make that range kind of stay there. So it's a little handy to do that. In the this is all the same. Is this the same? It is the same. I have the same unison settings on both, because you can turn on the part link, which means that whenever you move a parameter on one side, it'll move the parameter on the other side. But if you want to make something different, you have to change them up. And actually, I did do something interesting over here. So I engaged a detune here, which just sold this part. Welcome to only stereo. And then if I did this, but then this, it essentially pumps it up and then almost brings it back to the correct spot, but it's not quite the same. And then layered with the original. That's pretty neat. Not doing anything else totally special over here. I have more prism on here than I do on the other side, which is creating a different kind of phase cancellation profile that's present only on the side and on the mid. I have distortion, which is going on both of them, with some compression to bring it back up. The sharpness is really high on the side over here. The sharpness, if you've ever tried Harmor resampling and you ran into that kind of weird lo-fi watery sound, it's a result of of the sharpness doing its thing. And if you just sort of disabled it, like the farther you get, the closer you get to the center, which is the off position, because it's two different kinds of sharpness, the more synthetic it sounds. I'd be thinking, well, it's always synthetic, but I mean, like the more like it's a really hard thing to explain, but it becomes a lot flatter. And I didn't want that. I usually don't want that, but like, because it sounds way better when it does work with the sharpness. But then sometimes, pretty much all the time, you just can't escape that like high frequency muddled sound. You can kind of solve it with the format stuff by changing the formats around, and also by altering your harmonic usage profile. There's a lot of different ways to solve that I've just discovered over the years, but the sharpness is the easiest one to kind of get around. Yeah. So then I did that here. Recorded that into an Edison and dropped it into a second Harmor. This is as pretty regular as less than the other one. A and B, same deal. very different profiles on both. This is these sort of lines that show up is actually what the phase cancellation looks like when we're doing it with the unison, which is way different than it looks like when you're doing it with regular unison or the manual unison, where you write a sample out and then do it yourself. This is the result of the harmonics not being perfectly correct, as it would be if it were a recorded sample. Yeah, so image format mutation is engaged on the front and also turned down a bit. So this is the same profile, but then pulled down. I just kind of do that kind of stuff to taste and just move stuff around until it sounds right. Less sharp than usual. However, both of these have the sharpness automated. Now this is handy because that whole thing about the sharpness profile, where like sometimes it sounds good on the high, sometimes it sounds good on the low. It's much like the delay, where like if you leave it on either, the obviousness of it sounds too much if it's there the whole time. But if you kind of fade between the two of them, then it sounds a lot more unique as a result. So these two are moving, but they're moving independently. So the sharpness of the mid and the side are different over time. Harmor protection on the top, on the mid, not on the side. Prism on the side, not in the mid. And then some distortion, low amounts. And this is actually why I like using log a lot. Logarithmic distortion is actually just the same thing as whenever I use a wave shaper and do one of these. It's not, I actually used to say that the Harmor's distortion is literally the wave shaper, but it's actually not. It's a formula-based version of the distortion plugin, which is to say that instead of just doing it manually by doing this, it's created by a formula which causes this shape. The beautiful thing about logarithmic distortion, though, is that there is a beginning and an end, and if you have a lower level signal, it doesn't act as distorted as it would if it were a higher level signal. So that means I can come in here and bring the amount down, and if I brought it all the way down, it would not distort. Not the same for a lot of the other kinds of distortion, which will distort no matter what. And so this means I'm able to carefully control how much distortion's in there without having to worry about like dry, wet mixing and that kind of thing. You might be thinking what's the difference between the formula-based versions and the wave shaper versions, but one of the particular benefits is that in the distortion here, you can actually change on the fly your asymmetrical amount either way, and the regular wave shaper, you can turn it on and off. And you can't do stereo asymmetrical distortion, at least in one wave shaper. You can do it with patch split, but not in just one unit, which is why this distortion is kind of nice. Yeah, the sharpness control, and then like the mid-side split is pretty even. I'm not doing any informant changes on the side, and then it's kind of in the center because it has about the same stereo profile that the other one did, because it was routed that way. So that's why I didn't have to bring it down again. So this is basically that. Like, I like this version of it, but like this is, I think, the most solid outcome of every step here. And I do like things like this because every step of the way you get interesting things. Like, this is nice. And honestly, this is nice too. This sound, at least the version of it, was young to be just the how to bass, and I decided, no, I need to go further. And then this thing with the granulizing happened, and then this thing with the Harmor resampling happened. So we're using a lot of tricks to cause some serious damage. Particularly found at this part, because like that's how like originally, and then the granulizing turned into that. So granulizing is something I don't really do very often, and most of the time it's because I don't have the kind of control that I want over it. But I actually do. It's just a lot. It takes a lot more consideration than the typical kinds of processes, just by the way that it functions, because it's kind of interesting. Yeah. So this entire project with zips and all the audio files will be available to download in the description of this video. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And as usual, have a nice day.